I'm David Bender. I host a program on Air America Radio called Politically Direct. Let me introduce Dolores Huerta, one of the co-founders of the United Farm Workers Union with Cesar Chavez, Ruth Ashton Taylor, the journalist covering that night, Rick Tuttle, former Los Angeles City Controller, but also, and you can tell just looking at him, just picture him as a graduate student in 1968 as the head of students for Robert Kennedy here in California, Rick Tuttle. And on my far left, appropriately enough, Paul Schrade, who was the Western Regional Director of the United Auto Workers and one of Senator Robert Kennedy's strongest and most important supporters in the California primary campaign, in fact, throughout the campaign. And as many of you may know, yes, entirely a round of applause. Many of you may know that Paul was one of those who was wounded in the hotel that night, and we are very grateful, happily, that he is here with us and has been continuing, as Dolores has, as Rick Tuttle has, the legacy of Robert Kennedy in the work that I think only just began in that campaign in 1968. So thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to turn now to Ruth Ashton Taylor, who was actually covering the campaign. Now, let me ask you a question just to start. Had you covered the entire primary campaign?
No, I followed his campaign around Southern California as much as you could follow it around. You had to be way back there very often because he was always surrounded by a crowd that was leaping up into the car where he was and grabbing at his cufflinks. I was interested in the program or in the film to see very often he had his sleeves rolled up because everybody was grabbing his cufflinks.
He ran through a pair of cufflinks every day.
Right, and he was surrounded. One of the things that is so shocking in a lot of ways. He was in a controlled situation when he was at the ambassador that evening, whereas in his campaigning, he was never in a controlled situation. It was just mayhem and huge numbers of people grabbing at him and he seeming to love every bit of it. And of course, as the film shows, that evening it was not completely formal the way he was on the stage, and people were excited there. But
did you ever interview him directly?
Oh yes, it wasn't easy to get him aside. In fact, some of the people who were working with him kept trying to get him aside because every time you would get him for a little interview, there would be a crowd of people who would gather around, and you couldn't have him by himself. And I will tell this story because finally one of those persons, PR people who had been trying to get him aside for me to do the interview, we were at a luncheon.
You're not from Czechoslovakia, though, right? No.
But we were trying to get an interview, and finally he said, well, come on now. He just went to the men's room, and we'll get him when he comes out, and we did. That was the only time I actually stood with him, with the two of us, talking for a period of time because he was so popular.
Where were you?
I was covering another election for
Max Rafferty?
Max Rafferty, yeah.
People will remember that there was another event that night in the hotel, and this was so remarkable about the way Emilio has done the research, and he really spent 6 years writing this film. But they were that busy that night. They had multiple parties going on in the hotel, and Max Rafferty, the right-wing candidate for Senate, won his primary that night.
I was assigned to him, and somebody came to me, though, looking very sad and concerned, and said, Ruth, you've got to come to the other auditorium. Kennedy has been shot. It was people all through the hotel who were it seemed to be in shock. It was not bedlam at all at that point. People just quiet, not believing what had happened. It was a very sad feeling among reporters. You cover a lot of things, but that was one of the ones you'd never forget and ever forget the way you felt.
Dolores Huerta, thank you, Ruth. Dolores, can you remember when you first met Robert Kennedy and the circumstances of that?
It was kind of a funny story. we had an organization here called the Community Service Organization, which is the organization that both Cesar Chavez and myself came out of. And what we did was register voters. In that particular election, well, it was actually when John Kennedy was running, we had registered like 140,000 Latino voters in California. And another organization tried to take credit for us, and Bobby had put an article in Time magazine. And so, of course, we were pretty upset. So he was going to be at the Coronado Hotel. And so I had this Time magazine in my hand. I'm rushing towards him, and he says, oh, I know. Don't worry, he says, I'm writing a letter to correct it. I know it was your group that did that. But, you know, over the years, he stayed very, very close to us. Later on, when we had started the union, because of Paul Schrade, who connected us with the senator, he had fundraisers for, we didn't have a clinic in Delano, California, where we had this huge strike. And he did a fundraiser for us in Marin County so that we could have a little portable clinic there, a trailer, so that the farm workers would have some place to go, especially during the evening. And then when we were in New York City during the Great Boycott, we had a bunch of farm workers that went out to New York City, and they're picketing out there, and 40 of them got arrested. And so we called the senator's office, and we said, we have 40 farm workers that just got arrested. And so right away he sent his attorneys down there to make sure we got all of our people out of jail. And then, of course, you saw the scenes where he's breaking bread with Caesar. But at the beginning of the movie, though, there is that shot there where he's telling the sheriff of Kern County and the district attorney to go read the Constitution. Because what happened is during the strike that we had during Delano, the famous grape strike, they kept arresting us, you know.
Before a crime was committed.
Yeah, before we did anything wrong. So it was almost impossible to picket because we just, you know, we'd go out the picket line, they'd pick us up and put us in jail. And so that was just a very famous quote when he brought his committee. That was a Senate committee that he brought to Delano to hear about the strike. On that night of the election, we had a ballroom with mariachis waiting for the senator. Where as soon as we came off the podium, the plan was I was supposed to escort him to this ballroom. And as we were going through the kitchen on the way to the podium, the workers started waving at him. And then he left and started shaking hands with them. And I remember feeling a chill at that point because, you know, Caesar had a lot of death threats on his life. And so I was very conscious of security. When we went up to the room, you know, to walk the senator down, he didn't have any security. He had one person, I believe. And I thought to myself, how can he only have one person as security? But, you know, the whole moment was so incredible. And Mr. Chu said that we didn't know that history was going to be made that night. Well, all of us that were there did think that history was going to be made that night because we know if Robert Kennedy, you know, would become the president of the United States, that the war would be over, you know, racism would start going down instead of, you know, growing as it had been. So many things would have been made right. So to us, we knew it was a historical moment, you know, because we thought we were going to have a president that really cared about poor people, cared about people of color, you know, that was an activist president that would get out there and really do things to make the world a better place.
A key moment for so many of us is when he went to Delano, and Paul Schrade, Dolores Huerta worked with him to go to Delano at a time where almost every other political figure in the state, Democrat or certainly Republican, were turning their back on the farm workers, staying away. And he went and associated himself with that effort. So with all that, and with the sense that many of us had that in order to accomplish this mountain of a job, to climb that mountain, to defeat the sitting president and change American foreign policy, that Robert Kennedy had the combination of the toughness to be able to do it, the political skills, and a big heart. And that's why I got involved and so many of us got involved.
You had gone to the South and helped to register voters. Remind people or share with people who don't even know the history of that. That was, talk about student organizing in a very dangerous time. That was really the beginning of your student activism, is that right?
That's a fair statement. I was, in the summer of 1963, this was the summer after the fire hoses in Birmingham and before the March on Washington. I was in Mississippi and then went on to Georgia. And I was one of those student organizers who, frankly, for a time was pretty impatient with Senator Kennedy. We were then Attorney General Kennedy, and with the White House. because we were wondering what FBI agents were doing standing around to earn their living. We were wondering what they're doing to earn their keep when they were standing around taking notes and watching civil rights workers, including civil rights workers on interstate travel, which is clearly federal, getting their teeth kicked in. Well, we were not aware of this. We simply weren't insiders, and we're not aware of the split between J. Edgar Hoover and Robert Kennedy. That wonderful picture in the film of their arms folded, the body language was exquisite in that film as they were with each other. In any event, so I was in that posture, I think a critical posture, and then the civil rights organization, the Chatham County Crusade for Voters, which was a Dr. King Southern Christian Leadership Conference affiliate, sent me in to keep an eye on some of the white supremacist organizations. It was about the most damn fool thing one could do. I'd been marching around in civil rights marches in Chatham County and Savannah. Next thing you know, I'm in.
You're how old at this point?
I'm 23 at the time.
23.
And I'm there, and
It's a good time to be a damn fool, actually.
sticking out, and lucky I didn't get my teeth kicked in. But in any event, I was there, and I began to listen to the leaders, the speakers at these rallies, excoriating the Attorney General, excoriating Robert Kennedy.
These are the white supremacists.
You bet. And then I began to think somewhat differently of Robert Kennedy, began to see him in different terms. And of course, the other thing which had happened with the death of Medgar Evers, President Kennedy, a few days earlier, this is I happened to be in Mississippi when this happened, on or about the 13th or 14th of June of 1963, President Kennedy, for the first time, a United States president, made civil rights a moral issue. For the first time, he moved away from simply saying we're going to support federal court orders. And of course, Robert Kennedy was on point for that.
Let me bring it back to June 4th. Where were you during the events of that night?
Well, I started out in the embassy room of the ambassador, then went upstairs to the 5th floor to the suite. And I was
To Senator Kennedy's actual hotel suite in the hotel.
That's right. I delivered a message up there and then was invited to stay there. So I did. He was in another room, but as he came down the hallway to the elevator to go downstairs, he passed by me and we acknowledged each other, and I said congratulations to him, and he acknowledged that. And then I came downstairs, and we walked towards the back of the hall, and then there's a literary convention that I understood for the first time, and that is the room heaved. It was like undulating waves coming across as word came back across the room that this horror had taken place. And for many of us, it was, oh my goodness, not again, was the phrase, because we all thought of course, the assassination of President Kennedy. We knew it. We had hope. We knew he had been shot, and word also reached us he's badly hurt, still alive, and then, but also
rumors were flying fast throughout the hotel,
flying all over the place, and that also we had been through so much as a country because Medgar Evers, the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, we had taken 5 assassinations in less than 5 years. Medgar Evers, the head of the NAACP in Mississippi, was murdered in June of 1963, then President Kennedy, then Malcolm X, who was going through a very interesting evolution of his own. He was shot down and killed. Then Dr. Martin Luther King, and now Senator Kennedy. And Senator Kennedy, as the film indicates, the actor said, really represented, in terms of the giants, the last best hope. And it left many of us with a feeling, in addition to our despair, with, well, it's up to the rest of us.
Let me go back to what Dolores was saying about his visit to Delano, to be there to celebrate the end of Cesar Chavez's long fast. When he met people like Cesar Chavez the first time in Delano in 1966, there were very few words passed. But there was that kind of look on each other's faces, that said something about how they felt about each other. And that kind of emotional reaction was something that Bob Kennedy had. In fact, there's a play in New York, one-man play done by Jack Holmes, with a series of statements by Robert Kennedy. He was playing Robert Kennedy through a whole hour. And Peter Edelman, one of his chief aides in the senatorial office, wrote to me and said, "Did you ever hear Bob Kennedy speak more than a few words at any one time?" And that was what he was. He was able to communicate in very few words and a certain sensitivity about you got when you were talking to him. So when we left the celebration of the fast, we had to stuff him in a car. As Dolores pointed out, he was just being mobbed. I left at that point. He was on the way to the Delano airport by car. And what I found out is that Jim Drake, who is no longer with us, one of the ministers in the movement, Bob sat in the car going to the airport and said, "I've got to run, I've got to run, I've got to run." This was before New Hampshire, by the way.
Paul, I want to take you to June 4th. You were on stage, and I think, and I'm remembering this from still pictures, but as you pan back, one can see you standing on the stage near Senator Kennedy as he was giving that speech.
That night, I had not planned to go to the victory party, which I felt was going to happen. And here Dolores and Cesar and the people in the farm workers movement should take the most credit for winning the campaign in California, because they registered thousands and thousands of new people. Because of the grape strike and the boycott, there was a lot of support in the cities as well as out in the countryside. And that's why Bob won. I wasn't planning to go. I was living in the Baldwin Hills, heard on the radio that we were behind. So I said, I better go down to the hotel. This is going to be devastating. Bob's going to lose, and he's not going to be a candidate for president. Well, when I got there, I was invited upstairs, as Rick was, and to the 5th floor, and they got the room numbers right up there in the movie. And things were just going great. There were lots of people. There was several rooms open on the 5th floor. And so I sat with Bob and watched the results for a while on the floor, and calls were going out to Kansas City, to New York, and Chicago, and so forth. And we finally decided it was time to go down, and we went into the bedroom where he made his notes on the speech that he was going to make down in the ballroom. On the way down, he stopped me and said, "I understand Cesar Chavez had to leave the hotel, and Dolores is going to be with us. Will you write her name down for me so I get it right when I thank her on the platform?" And I stopped in her room, picked up a piece of paper, wrote it down, and then a couple of us ran down the stairs. We caught up with Bob in the kitchen, and it was just very exciting because people in the kitchen, mostly Latino, were saying, you know, "Viva Kennedy, Kennedy for Presidente." And we walked out on the platform and for a speech. And it was just wonderful hearing him, because he was speaking from very few notes, but the eloquence and the feeling that you got for him, it was a person that really could be the president of all of us in the country. He reached around and shook my hand when he thanked me, because I was standing fairly close to him. I got the signal to go off the left side of the platform. Dolores, you were going to take him off the right side of the platform, which was to take him down to the other ballroom where another crowd was formed that he wanted to thank. Well, the signal to go to the left rather than to the right was one made by his own people, I found out, because I heard that when I was told to go that way. And the reason for that is something that Ruth mentioned, and that is the print media, the newspaper people, didn't have access the way television had out on the streets and out in the campaign. And he wanted to go meet with the newspaper people, and he promised them that opportunity. And so we were heading through the pantry to go across the hallway into the Colonial Ballroom. Well, when he came in behind me, he said, "Paul, I want you and Jess Unruh with me over at the press conference." I waved to Jess. We stopped and shook hands with he shook hands with two guys in the kitchen, Jesus Perez and Juan Romero. He's portrayed as Jose in the film.
That's Freddie Rodriguez's
Freddie
character,
Rodriguez.
the Busboy.
And as he was shaking hands with Juan Romero, I remember the look on Juan's face. It was similar to what I saw in the face of Cesar Chavez when they first met in 1966 in Delano. And in my mind, I said, this is what this campaign is all about. We're going to have a president. And I turned to go, and I started shaking quite violently. And I thought I was being electrocuted. And I fell. I know I was being trampled at one point. A friend of mine told me that, Cap Hardy, who stood over me when I was on the floor. The next thing I remember was regaining consciousness, and a doctor was with me, and he may be here tonight. Dr. Ursher, are you here tonight?
Dr. Ursher.
He said to me, you're going to be okay. We're taking you to LA Receiving Hospital. And I said, but I'm a member of the Kaiser plan. And even in the worst moments, the most tragic, horrible moments, there's always humor. And I've lived with that because it's a very difficult experience to get over. And he said, I'm a doctor from Kaiser. You're ours. We'll get you there. I believe his wife was with him, standing with him, too. They were there supporting Robert Kennedy. I found out in this reunion that we had that he also went with me in the ambulance to LA Receiving and then to Kaiser. So I was a customer, so he was taking care of me.
My wife and I were working in the Kennedy La Puente headquarters for Kennedy during that campaign and during that afternoon. So we came to the victory party at the Ambassador Hotel in the embassy room, and it was a very hot night. The room was a very narrow room, big crowd. After we heard Bobby Kennedy say, on to Chicago, and we're going to win there was a few moments, and then I heard some pops, and I thought some balloons had broken. And then I heard somebody yell, is there a doctor, as you see in the film? And I didn't really comprehend what had happened, but my wife did, and she pushed me forward. I went to the door to the right of the podium, and you don't know where you are, you don't know what's happening, and suddenly I came across Robert Kennedy prone on the floor, Ethel Kennedy at his feet. So I bent down, took his hand, felt his pulse, looked at him. His head was to the right. His right eye was deviated. The pupil was dilated. Ethel was hysterical. She was yelling, is he going to be okay? Is he going to be okay? Is he going to be okay? And then across me came another doctor, so I then started to look around what else was happening. And parallel to Bobby, almost head to head, was Paul Schrade. So I bent down, and Paul was conscious at that point, and I inspected the wounds in his head, and he had a wound in the front and in the back. And at that point, he was conscious. I thought he was really a lucky guy that he had a couple wounds of superficial wounds. They started to move Kennedy after that. They brought in a stretcher. And Ethel, at that point, hysterically was yelling, I'll never forget this, don't move him, don't move him, don't hurt him, don't hurt him. Of course, they took him out. In those days, you have to remember there were no paramedics. They didn't have much of a medical plan and for the disaster in the area. And of course, there was no Secret Service security. We had to move Paul Schrade on a kitchen table because they didn't bring another stretcher. The embassy ballroom was subterranean, so we had to move him out through a screaming, hysterical crowd. If you think this was a drama, the drama of that evening was nothing like what you saw in the film. I mean, there was pandemonium in that little pantry. People were screaming. I looked up and I saw Rosie Greer next to him, not realizing later on he had Saran under his foot. Jesse Unruh was just completely upset. He was just he was in terrible shape. So he took Paul out on the 6 of us on the kitchen table, up through into an elevator, up to the main floor, out to the crowd. And in those days, again, they didn't have paramedics, so we had one of those fire ambulances. We had nowhere to put him, so we all held him as best we could and racing to the streets. We had no idea where we were going. We ended up at Central Receiving Hospital. We got there, and I asked, those days they didn't have CAT scans, so I asked, do you have a skull x-ray? No skull x-ray at night. So I said, do you have an IV? So we started an IV. We stabilized Paul. I left him to go to another room and to see what was happening, and there was a fellow named Bill Wiesel, who was a unit ABC director. They were asking him where he'd like to go to a hospital. He said, I don't know, I'm from Washington, D.C. So I said, put him in the ambulance. So we took Paul and Bill Wiesel over to Kaiser. Paul was very lucky. Paul's a tall man. If he was about an inch taller, he would have had a bullet in his brain. So it was an evening of pandemonium, but I was proud as a 30-year-old doctor to have repatriated 2 people and brought them to good health.
Thank you. Let's talk to the folks who are here. You all have, Warren, you have a microphone. Warren
Yes.
Wilson, ladies and gentlemen, a
Thank you.
distinguished Warren Wilson, a reporter who was also there. Warren, tell us about where you were that night.
Well, I was at the Ambassador Hotel and had been doing stories prior to Senator Kennedy's arrival.
You were covering for KFWB at that point?
KFWB, yes. At the time, I was with radio. And I was standing next to Rosa Greer on stage. After the speech, when Kennedy started to go off stage, I stepped behind him because, as Ruth mentioned earlier, I was trying to get that exclusive. And I figured that I could perhaps talk to him on tape while he was walking out into the pantry. But Rosie Greer, a friend of mine and close friend of the Kennedys.
And bigger than you.
Bigger than me, indeed, bigger than me, grabbed me by the arm, Paul, and said, Warren, I will be, thank you. Warren, step back, at least let Ethel get behind him. And when I stepped back, I don't know if there was Secret Service or not, but somebody...
No Secret Service.
No Secret Service. Somebody official pushed me back even farther. And that is the reason, because I went down to the bottom of the steps off stage, and I heard shots. And had Rosa Greer not pushed me back, I feel that I would have been one of the victims there that night. And I was lucky, thank God. But that would have been less of an impact on me, had I been shot, than the impact of Kennedy being killed, stopped, at a moment in America's history where we needed him and his advocacy more than ever before.
Thank you very much. Thank the entire panel. And thank you. Thank you for staying.